The beginning of the end started with a crack in the facade. Jack had been married to Rachel for 8 years, a union that once felt like the cornerstone of his life. But recently, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was off. Rachel's once effortless warmth felt mechanical, and her phone, a device she used to leave carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side. The alarms in Jack's head were faint at first, whispers of insecurity he dismissed as paranoia. Then came the slip. One Friday evening, Rachel came home late, flushed with an energy Jack hadn't seen in months. She claimed it was a meeting that ran over, but the hint of cologne that wasn't Jack's and a stray red wine stain on her blouse whispered a different story. Jack played it cool, asking innocuous questions as she kicked off her heels and breezed past him into the bathroom. But her evasive answers and the way her eyes darted away told him everything he needed to know: something wasn't right. Jack decided not to confront her immediately. He didn't want to give her time to spin a convincing tale or erase evidence. Instead, he began to watch, subtly, carefully. Over the next few days, her behavior confirmed his suspicions. She laughed too hard at her text notifications, claimed work was keeping her late more frequently, and once, while clearing the dining table, her phone buzzed with a message from someone named Greg. She quickly snatched it up and turned the screen away, her face flushed with a sheepish smile. "Work stuff," she muttered when Jack asked. His stomach tightened. But Jack didn't argue. Instead, he let her think she had fooled him, even encouraged her to believe so. Each passing day, his resolve hardened. Rachel was hiding something, and he would uncover it. One evening, after Rachel had left for yet another urgent meeting, Jack rummaged through her drawers. In the bottom corner of her vanity, tucked beneath a pile of scarves she rarely wore, he found a small, expensive bottle of perfume he'd never seen before. The tag on the box confirmed it was brand new. It wasn't for him. Rachel had never been subtle with her gift-giving, and their anniversary had already passed. The tipping point came the following weekend. Rachel claimed she needed to go on an overnight work trip to a neighboring city. Jack, ever the supportive husband, waved her off with a kiss and a reminder to call him when she arrived. He spent that night in the silence of their once loving home, his mind racing. The next morning, he discovered she had forgotten to log out of her laptop. Curiosity overtook him, and within minutes, Jack uncovered a trail of emails. The sender's name was Greg, and the messages left no room for doubt. Greg wasn't a colleague. He was her lover. As the realization settled in, anger bubbled up inside Jack. But rather than confront Rachel immediately, he opted for patience. He wasn't a man of empty threats. He wanted irrefutable proof, something that would leave Rachel unable to weasel out with half-truths or denials. If she had been disrespectful enough to bring this affair into their marriage, he would lay it bare for all to see. Jack spent the next week meticulously preparing. He purchased cameras small enough to go unnoticed, wiring them discreetly throughout their home. He ensured the devices were sound-activated and would stream directly to his phone. He hated the idea of playing spy, but Rachel had forced his hand. He had to know the truth. The cameras went live on a Thursday morning. Jack kissed Rachel goodbye as she left for work, holding her gaze a moment longer than usual. "You okay?" she asked, her tone casual. "Yeah, just tired," Jack replied, flashing a weak smile. But behind that facade was a storm brewing, a determination to expose the betrayal that had hollowed out the marriage he had cherished. Jack's heart ached at the thought of what he might uncover, but he steeled himself for the truth. That evening, as he monitored the cameras from his phone, Jack watched the first cracks in Rachel's lie deepen. She wasn't at work late, nor was she stuck in traffic. She was home with Greg. They walked through the front door together, laughing like teenagers, their bodies close, their intentions clear. As Jack watched them, his rage simmered to a boil. This was no longer about a broken heart. This was about justice. Jack's hands trembled as he turned off the live feed. The sight of Rachel with Greg, laughing in their home like it was some kind of love nest, burned into his mind. He sat in the dark living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator his only company, and planned his next move. There would be no screaming confrontation, no tearful shouting match. Jack wanted something bigger, something she couldn't manipulate, escape, or deny. By morning, his fury had cooled into a laser-focused determination. He knew one thing: catching them in the act wasn't enough. Rachel had betrayed him in a way that demanded justice, not just for him but for everyone who had been fooled by her sweet, unassuming demeanor. She had brought Greg into their home, into their sanctuary, and acted as though it were her right. Jack wanted everyone, her friends, her family, their colleagues, to see who she truly was. The first step was information. Jack spent the day combing through her emails and social media accounts. He pieced together Rachel and Greg's clandestine routine, the afternoons they spent at client meetings, the weekends Greg claimed to be on business trips. He even tracked down the boutique where she had purchased the new perfume, something Greg had gushed about in one of their emails. With each discovery, Jack felt his plan solidify. The next step required precision. Jack bought more surveillance equipment, this time focused on audio. He wanted not just video proof but the unfiltered sounds of their deceit. He carefully placed microphones in the living room, bedroom, and even the kitchen, places Rachel and Greg seemed to favor based on the footage he had already captured. But he wasn't done. Jack knew that to make this airtight, he needed a moment of clarity that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. It wasn't enough to see them flirt or even kiss. He needed them caught in the throes of passion, their betrayal fully exposed. By the end of the week, Jack's preparations were complete. The cameras were set, the microphones perfectly hidden, and the live feed ready on his phone. He had even connected the devices to a cloud storage system, ensuring he wouldn't lose a single second of footage. All that was left was the waiting. Rachel's next work trip came sooner than expected. On Friday morning, she kissed Jack goodbye, her lips brushing his cheek with a practiced ease that turned his stomach. "Don't wait up," she said with a playful smile. "It's going to be a late night." "I'm sure it will," Jack replied, his tone even. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, Jack went to work. He cleared out his work obligations and set up shop at a motel a few miles away, where he could monitor the live feed in privacy. He double-checked every camera angle, every microphone, ensuring nothing was out of place. Then, with a deep breath, he waited. By early evening, Rachel returned home with Greg. They entered through the front door, laughing and holding hands. Jack's jaw clenched as he watched Greg casually kick off his shoes and toss his jacket over the back of the couch, a move Jack himself had done countless times. The audacity of it was staggering. Rachel poured 2 glasses of wine as they settled on the couch. Greg leaned in close, whispering something that made Rachel giggle like a teenager. Jack's fingers hovered over the phone screen, his heart racing as he recorded the feed. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Show me everything." It didn't take long. Greg pulled Rachel into his lap, their laughter giving way to heated kisses. Jack's stomach churned, but he forced himself to watch, to listen, to capture every damning second. The microphones picked up the soft rustling of clothes, the murmured words of affection, and finally, the unmistakable sounds of their betrayal. Jack leaned back, his mind reeling. The evidence was undeniable. He could feel his anger surging again, but he forced it down. He needed to stay calm. This wasn't the time to lose control, it was the time to execute the final phase of his plan. He waited until they had fallen asleep, tangled in each other's arms on the couch, before he acted. Logging into his cloud account, Jack uploaded the footage and prepared a file that would destroy Rachel's carefully curated life. He added timestamps, context, and a brief but damning explanation of what the video showed. Then, with a click of a button, he began sending it. Rachel's parents. Her friends. Her colleagues at work. Even Greg's wife. No one was spared. The silence after Jack pressed send was deafening. His motel room was dimly lit, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound. But he wasn't alone in that quiet. His heart thudded in his chest, the weight of what he had done settling over him. Jack knew there was no coming back from this. He wasn't looking for reconciliation or understanding, just the brutal justice that Rachel and Greg had earned. It started with the first notification. Rachel's phone buzzed back at the house, cutting through the quiet of the living room where she and Greg were still sprawled across the couch. She groaned as the screen lit up, showing the name of one of her closest friends. Greg stirred beside her but didn't move. Rachel reached for the phone lazily, her face morphing from sleepy contentment to confusion as she opened the message. Her friend had sent a single sentence, "What the hell is this, Rachel?" She frowned and clicked the attached video. The moment her own laughter from earlier that evening echoed through the phone, Rachel's blood ran cold. She sat bolt upright, her breath catching as she realized what she was watching, herself, tangled in Greg's embrace, the sordid proof of her affair in horrifyingly high resolution. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand trembling as she paused the video. "What's wrong?" Greg asked groggily, sitting up. Rachel didn't answer. Her phone buzzed again and again, messages flooding in from coworkers, friends, and family. Each one carried the same tone: shock, disgust, outrage. Her mother's text was the most devastating: "How could you do this? What would Jack think?" Rachel turned to Greg, her eyes wide and wild. "Someone filmed us," she hissed, shoving the phone at him. Greg took one look at the screen and paled. "What the hell is this?" "Who?" He cut himself off, realization dawning. "Jack." Rachel shook her head, panic bubbling in her chest. "No, he wouldn't, he doesn't know. He can't know." "Rachel," Greg said firmly, his voice sharp, "he knows. This is him. No one else would have access to." The shrill ring of Rachel's phone interrupted him. She stared at the screen, her boss's name flashing ominously. She let it ring, too paralyzed by fear to answer. Greg's phone buzzed a moment later, his wife's name lighting up the display. Greg swore under his breath, jumping up from the couch. "I need to leave. I can't, she'll kill me. You can't leave me here alone." Rachel snapped, but Greg was already scrambling for his shoes, his panic overtaking any sense of loyalty. "Figure it out, Rachel. This is your house, your mess." Greg barked before slamming the door behind him, leaving her alone to face the storm. Meanwhile, Jack sat in his car outside the house, watching the faint glow of the living room light through the curtains. He knew the chaos unfolding inside, and a dark satisfaction settled in his chest. He could almost hear Rachel's gasps, see her frantically typing back to every horrified friend and family member. But Jack wasn't done. He had one more card to play, and he intended to use it. He dialed a number he had been holding onto all day. The call was answered on the first ring. "This is Jessica," the voice said, tight with tension. "Hi, Jessica. My name's Jack. I think you're Greg's wife," he began, keeping his tone calm and steady. There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "What is this about?" "I think you already know," Jack replied. "But in case you need confirmation, I sent you an email a few minutes ago. It has all the proof." There was another silence, heavier this time. Then Jessica spoke, her voice low and icy. "Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry you had to find out this way," Jack said, and he meant it. Jessica wasn't the enemy here, she was another victim of their spouse's deceit. Jessica hung up without another word, leaving Jack in the quiet once more. Inside the house, Rachel was spiraling. Every attempt to call Jack went straight to voicemail. Her texts, apologies, excuses, desperate pleas for forgiveness, were ignored. For the first time in years, she realized she had no control over the narrative. The night stretched on as Rachel faced the consequences of her actions. Every buzz of her phone felt like a punch to the gut, another bridge burned. By morning, the life she had carefully built, a career, a reputation, a marriage, was in shambles. And Jack? Jack was gone, leaving Rachel to sift through the wreckage. Rachel barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jack's face, not the kind, steady husband she had grown used to, but the cold, unyielding expression he must have worn while he set her world on fire. Her phone buzzed intermittently on the table beside her, and she didn't dare look. Each message was another reminder of her collapse, another wound from someone she had fooled for years. When the sun finally rose, she was still on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket Greg had carelessly tossed over them hours before. Her mind was spinning, clinging to fragments of a plan. There had to be a way to fix this, to salvage what was left. Rachel's first instinct was to find Jack. She needed to explain, to apologize, to grovel if necessary. She told herself she could make him see reason, that the betrayal wasn't as catastrophic as it seemed. He loved her, he had always loved her, and love could be enough to weather this storm. She dressed hastily, throwing on the first outfit she found, and drove to his office. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her eyes darting to her phone in the passenger seat. She had left voicemails, sent dozens of texts, but Jack's silence was deafening. When she arrived at the office, Rachel forced herself to breathe. She smoothed her hair, wiped the lingering mascara from under her eyes, and adopted the calm, confident demeanor that had always gotten her through sticky situations. Jack wasn't at his desk, so she approached the receptionist. "I'm looking for my husband, Jack," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. The receptionist frowned. "Jack took the day off," she replied. Rachel's stomach sank. He had anticipated this, had removed himself from her reach. She thanked the woman and returned to her car, the first hints of panic clawing at her chest. If Jack wouldn't come to her, she would have to go to him. She tried their closest friends, leaving vague, cheery messages asking if they had seen Jack. None of them responded, either too busy or unwilling to get involved. As the hours ticked by, Rachel began to understand the full scale of her predicament. Jack hadn't just hurt her, he had turned the people she depended on against her. Finally, in desperation, Rachel drove to Jack's parents' house. They had always adored her, doting on her like a daughter. If anyone could help her, it was them. When she knocked on the door, Jack's mother answered, her face lined with worry. "Rachel," she said, her voice cold. "Mrs. Carter," Rachel began, her voice faltering. I need to talk to Jack." "Is he here?" Jack's mother crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You think after what you've done, he'd come here?" "He told us everything, Rachel. Every disgusting detail. And I have to tell you, I've never been so ashamed to know someone." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes, but Jack's mother didn't soften. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice sharp. "You should leave, Rachel. Don't make this worse for yourself. Jack doesn't want to see you, and neither do we." The door closed firmly in Rachel's face, leaving her standing on the porch, humiliated. She returned home, her mind racing. For the first time, the possibility that she might lose everything began to feel real. Jack had always been the constant in her life, the solid foundation beneath her ambition. Without him, the carefully constructed image of her perfect life was unraveling. That evening, as she paced the empty living room, Rachel's phone buzzed. She grabbed it immediately, hoping against hope that it was Jack. Instead, it was her boss. The message was curt, "We need to talk. Be in my office first thing tomorrow." Rachel's breath hitched. Her stomach churned with dread. The video must have circulated at work. Her colleagues, her clients, people who respected her, admired her, had seen her betrayal. When she arrived at the office the next morning, her boss's expression confirmed her fears. "Rachel," he began, his tone clipped. "Your behavior has compromised the company's reputation. We've received calls from clients expressing their concern, and frankly, I don't blame them. I can't justify keeping you on. Consider this your last day." Her knees buckled as she heard the words. Fired. Her career, her identity, was gone, just like her marriage. Rachel left the office in a daze. She sat in her car, staring blankly at the steering wheel, unable to comprehend how quickly her life had fallen apart. The texts, the calls, the shame, all of it pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. The realization hit her like a freight train: Jack wasn't just angry. He had dismantled her life piece by piece, leaving her with nothing but regret. While Rachel floundered in the wreckage of her unraveling life, Jack was rebuilding his. After leaving his motel sanctuary, he moved into a rented studio apartment on the other side of town. The space was small but clean, a blank slate free from the memories of betrayal. It was exactly what he needed. Jack's focus now was simple: healing. He threw himself into his work, taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. In his free time, he found solace in the small joys he'd long neglected: morning jogs in the crisp air, cooking meals from scratch, and reconnecting with old friends who welcomed him with open arms. He had no intention of disappearing quietly, though. Jack wanted Rachel and Greg to understand the magnitude of their actions. He didn't just want to move on, he wanted justice, and it was coming. A week after the video leaked, Jack received a message from Jessica, Greg's wife. "Can we talk? I have an idea." Jack wasn't sure what to expect when he met her at a cafe downtown. Jessica arrived looking composed, her demeanor sharp and focused. Unlike Rachel, who was falling apart, Jessica seemed to thrive in the chaos, using it as fuel. "Thanks for meeting me," Jessica said, sliding into the chair across from him. Jack nodded. "What's on your mind?" Jessica leaned forward, her voice low. Greg tried to grovel his way back. "He's a mess, lost his job, lost his friends. But I'm not here to talk about him." Her lips curled into a determined smile. "I want to make sure people like Rachel and Greg can't escape this." Jack raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Jessica pulled out a folder. Inside were screenshots, financial records, and a timeline she had pieced together from Greg's emails and texts. "I did some digging," Jessica continued. "Greg and Rachel didn't just betray us, they've been lying to everyone. They embezzled from a joint account Greg used for work expenses. Turns out Rachel benefited from it, too. If we present this evidence to the right people, they'll face legal consequences." Jack studied the documents, his jaw tightening as he realized the depth of their deceit. This is airtight." Jessica nodded. "But it needs both of us. Greg's name is on everything, but Rachel's involvement ties it together. If we work together, we can make sure they pay for every lie." Jack hesitated. Part of him wanted to let go, to move on and leave Rachel's destruction to her own devices. But this wasn't just about revenge, it was about principle. "I'm in," Jack said finally. Over the next week, Jack and Jessica worked tirelessly, gathering every scrap of evidence they could find. Jessica's sharp mind and resourcefulness complemented Jack's steady resolve. Together, they built a case that could ruin Rachel and Greg, and not just personally but professionally. When the time came, they filed the complaint anonymously, ensuring that Rachel and Greg wouldn't see it coming. The fallout was swift. Both of them were hit with fraud investigations, their finances frozen as authorities began combing through the records. Meanwhile, Jack began to see life from a new perspective. His collaboration with Jessica had reminded him of his own resilience. She was nothing like Rachel, sharp-witted, driven, and fiercely independent. Their partnership had been built on shared pain, but as the days turned into weeks, Jack found himself looking forward to their meetings, their conversations. Jessica seemed to feel the same. One evening, after a long day of strategizing, she invited Jack over for dinner. It wasn't romantic, just two people leaning on each other, but Jack couldn't ignore the warmth that lingered in the air as they laughed over a bottle of wine. The progress was slow, but Jack was beginning to feel whole again. Rachel's betrayal no longer felt like the defining moment of his life. It was a painful chapter, but it wasn't the end of his story. For Rachel, however, things continued to spiral. Every door she tried to open seemed to slam shut. Her friends avoided her calls, her family expressed only disappointment, and her name was now associated with scandal and deceit. One night, sitting alone in the empty house that once felt like a haven, Rachel stared at the phone. She had tried to contact Jack countless times, but he never answered. This time, she wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling for closure. When the voicemail tone beeped, Rachel's voice cracked. "Jack. I know you hate me. I know I deserve it. But if you could just talk to me, explain why you did this, maybe I could understand. Please." She hung up, her chest hollow as the silence enveloped her. But Jack never called back. He was already miles ahead, rebuilding his life, while Rachel's world continued to crumble. What neither of them knew, however, was that something much bigger was brewing. And soon, it would come crashing into both of their lives with devastating consequences. Rachel woke up to the sound of pounding on her front door. The sharp, urgent knocks echoed through the house, and for a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But the pounding continued, relentless, until she stumbled out of bed and opened the door, heart racing. Two sharply dressed men stood on the porch, their expressions cold and professional. "Rachel Carter," one of them asked, holding up a badge. "We're with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant to search the premises." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Warrant? For what?" The man ignored her question, nodding to his partner. "We're investigating fraudulent activity linked to your accounts." "Step aside, ma'am." Rachel stammered, trying to form a coherent response, but the agents brushed past her, carrying briefcases and equipment. Panic set in as they began combing through her home, pulling files from her office, her laptop, and even her phone. By the time they left, Rachel was left standing in the center of her living room, her legs trembling. The investigation Jessica and Jack had initiated had escalated far beyond what she'd imagined. Her phone buzzed on the table, startling her. It was Greg. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Rachel," Greg hissed, his voice low and frantic. "They came to my office today. They froze my accounts. Do you have any idea what's happening? I just got raided." Rachel snapped, her voice cracking. "This is your fault, Greg. You dragged me into this mess." "My fault?" Greg shot back. "You were happy to spend the money. Don't act like you're innocent." The line went dead before Rachel could respond. She threw the phone across the room, watching it clatter to the floor. Everything was spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, Jack was watching from a distance. He and Jessica had kept tabs on the fallout, both relieved and satisfied that justice was finally catching up to their ex-spouses. The investigation had garnered attention in the local news, painting Rachel and Greg as fraudsters and cheats. But Jack wasn't gloating. For the first time since the betrayal, he felt a strange sense of peace. He no longer wanted to confront Rachel or even think about her. His focus was on his future, a future that looked brighter with each passing day. Jessica had become a constant presence in his life. Their bond, born from shared pain, had grown into something deeper. She was sharp, compassionate, and endlessly supportive, a stark contrast to the woman Jack had once called his wife. One evening, as they sat in Jessica's living room, Jack turned to her. "Do you think we're—" "I don't know, moving too fast?" he asked hesitantly. Jessica smiled softly. "Jack, after what we've been through, I think we've earned the right to move at our own pace. But if you're asking if I feel the same way you do, yes, I do." Jack nodded, his chest warming at her words. For the first time in months, he felt hopeful. Across town, Rachel was unraveling. Her legal troubles were mounting, her reputation was ruined, and Greg had disappeared, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The house, once a symbol of stability, now felt like a prison. One night, after a particularly scathing phone call from her parents, Rachel sat on the couch with a bottle of wine. She scrolled through old photos on her phone, her fingers lingering over pictures of her and Jack. She had lost him. She had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly mattered. The next morning, Rachel made a decision. She would fight. She would claw her way back to some semblance of normalcy. She had nothing left to lose. She met with a lawyer, who laid out her options in grim detail. "The charges are serious, Rachel. But if we can prove you were unaware of the fraud, we might be able to cut a deal." Rachel latched onto the possibility, even as she realized how slim her chances were. She spent the next weeks gathering evidence, trying to shift the blame onto Greg while protecting herself. But the deeper she dug, the more she realized the extent of her mistakes. Meanwhile, Jack continued to distance himself from the chaos. He and Jessica started to make plans for the future, both eager to leave their pasts behind. But neither of them anticipated the storm brewing just beyond their reach. Unbeknownst to Jack and Jessica, someone else had been watching. An anonymous figure with their own motives, who saw an opportunity to upend everything. The twist, when it came, would shake them all to their cores. 3 weeks after the investigation into Rachel and Greg began, Jack felt as though life was finally settling into place. His connection with Jessica grew stronger, transforming from companionship to something deeply meaningful. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. But peace is often deceptive. It began subtly. One evening, Jack received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Did you think this was over?" Curious, he opened it. Inside was a single link, followed by the words, "The truth always surfaces." Jack hesitated, his mind racing through the possibilities. Was this Rachel, attempting one last desperate move? Greg, clawing for some form of retaliation? Against his better judgment, he clicked the link. A video loaded, grainy at first but quickly resolving into something clear. It wasn't one of the videos Jack had recorded of Rachel and Greg. This footage was new, taken from what appeared to be inside Jessica's home. Jack's blood turned cold as he watched Jessica sitting at her desk, speaking on the phone. Her voice was calm, but her words made his stomach drop. He has no idea. Everything's going exactly as planned. The case against Rachel and Greg is airtight, and Jack's eating out of the palm of my hand. She paused, listening to the person on the other end. Then she laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Of course, I'll make my move soon. Once the dust settles, I'll have everything I need. Jack trusts me completely, it's almost too easy." The video ended abruptly. Jack stared at the screen, his heart pounding. His first instinct was denial. There had to be some mistake, some manipulation. Jessica couldn't have betrayed him, not after everything they had shared. But the voice, the tone, the unmistakable malice, it was her. Jack replayed the video, hoping to catch some detail, some clue that would explain what he had just seen. But the truth stared back at him, cold and undeniable. Jessica wasn't his ally. She was playing her own game, and Jack had been her unwitting pawn. The next day, Jack confronted her. He invited her over for dinner, masking his turmoil with a veneer of normalcy. Jessica arrived with a bottle of wine and her usual warm smile, completely unaware that Jack now saw her in a different light. As they ate, Jack casually brought up the investigation. "It's crazy how everything fell into place, isn't it?" he said, watching her closely. Jessica nodded. "Yeah, it's almost like fate." Jack's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his eyes piercing. Or maybe someone made sure it fell into place. Someone who knew exactly how to push all the right buttons. Jessica froze, her fork hovering in midair. For a split second, her mask slipped, and Jack saw the calculating look behind her eyes. Then she recovered, laughing nervously. "What are you talking about, Jack?" "I'm talking about the truth, Jessica," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "I saw the video. The one where you admitted everything. How you're using me. How this was all part of your plan." Jessica's face drained of color. She set down her fork, her hands trembling slightly. "Jack, I don't know what you think you saw, but—" "Don't lie to me," Jack snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You played me. Just like Rachel played me. I trusted you." Jessica's expression hardened. She leaned back in her chair, her demeanor shifting from defensive to defiant. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "You want the truth? Yes, I manipulated you. But don't act like you're some innocent victim. You wanted revenge as much as I did. You handed me everything I needed to destroy Rachel and Greg. And now, I'm taking what I deserve." "What do you mean, deserve?" Jack asked, his voice tight with anger. Jessica smiled, a cruel, calculated smile. "Rachel and Greg weren't just cheating on us. They were part of something bigger, a scam that lined their pockets for years. And now that they're out of the way, I'm going to finish what they started. The accounts they were siphoning money into? I have access. It's all mine now." Jack stared at her, disbelief and fury warring within him. "You're just like them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica shrugged. "Maybe. But unlike them, I don't get caught. And as long as you stay out of my way, you won't either." Jack stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Get out." Jessica hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then she grabbed her coat and walked to the door, pausing as she opened it. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice softer now, "I did care about you. But caring doesn't pay the bills." She left, the door clicking shut behind her. Jack sat alone in the quiet house, the weight of the betrayal settling over him. This time, though, he didn't feel broken. He felt resolved. Jessica thought she had won. But Jack had one thing she didn't count on, the video. And he wasn't afraid to use it.